what struck you about this topic that you wanted to do it among all the options that you had?
Yeah. So we have always been interested in medical history, and in the past years we've done more of like clinical medicine and medicine in the United States, but we always wanted to keep U.S. history, but we were very interested in World War II. And the reason why we were very intrigued about this topic is because these 77 nurses were brought to an internment camp, a prison camp, and they're held captive by the Japanese, and they all survived. None of them perished, but the thing is, when they got back to the United States, their story was not told until 1983. So we just wanted to bring light to this topic of these amazing group of nurses that weren't recognized, and a lot of people just don't know about their stories.
Do you know what changed around 1983 that finally made the story be told?
Yeah. So there was a lady, she was working in the Pentagon, and she came across a photo of some of the nurses together, and she realized that these nurses were amazing women, but it's been 40 years since they returned, and no one's ever recognized them. So she and a group of other women, they got together and they made a petition, and they brought it over to President Reagan and demanded that these women had to be recognized at the next POW MIA Day, because they deserve so much and they were so strong, and yet no one ever used their story to help prepare for future wars and instances.
I was reading your process paper, and it said you got to interview one of the authors of the book you read.
Yeah.
How did that interview go? Like, what were you seeking to find out that you couldn't find
So
in the
we
book?
interviewed Elizabeth Norman, and she wrote this book called We Band of Angels, which was arguably one of our most valuable sources because she cited primary sources, she summarized, there were timelines, images, maps, everything. And she actually knew, she had personal relationships with many of the nurses. Sadly, none of them are still alive today, but when we interviewed her, our main goal was to try to understand their legacy and what they left behind, because as they said, for 40 years, they didn't really have much of a legacy, but it wasn't until then when they got recognized that everything started changing, and Elizabeth Norman was able to shed some light on the impact that they had even 40 years after they got back.
And Elizabeth Norman, she's a professor at NYU, and she actually first found out about the story at the 1983 POW MIA Recognition Day, and she saw the picture of all the nurses together at that event. But she knew that she didn't know much information about them, so she was the one that took the initiative to start collecting personal testimonies. They had personal relationships with many of the nurses to compile all their information into this one book. And so she's like the know-it-all, like the go-to person or historian for this topic.
So if any of those nurses came in here today, what question would you like to ask them that you didn't get gleaned from your research?
One thing that the nurses didn't really do was have a legacy, because they were just so happy to be back home that they just went back into their society. They became mothers, or some went back to serving in the military. So I'd personally like to ask, is there anything that you would have liked to do differently to see how by not saying too much, it caused a lot of future issues? Like one of the nurses was in the Korean War, and they didn't use her expertise about this topic to prepare because the nurses here already were left without resources.
Right.
So I was wondering if they would want to say their story a little bit more, promote their idea instead of just slipping back into American society.
Another thing was, which we said in the performance, was that the government actually told them not to say anything. So even we were wondering, or we were curious as to why even then, that feels almost more as a motive to speak out, because obviously they had the potential to make serious change, and they decided not to. And it wasn't until way later that someone else decided, okay, now we can make change with them.
Were the nurses in your performance based on particular nurses from your sources, or were they more composite characters?
Yeah, they're a little bit more composite characters, since there was 77 nurses and a lot of different stories. But we took different scenes, and that was inspired by different nurses. The scene where I'm giving the instructions, that was taken from Maudie Davidson, who was the head army nurse, and was in charge of all the nurses in the corregidor. And the scene here where Hannah is a little bit more frantic, there was a 19-year-old who was serving. So we took that as if she was acting as if she was the 19-year-old, because she's not as mature, and she was taken under the wing by other nurses because she was so young in that situation. And the one scene over here when we're talking about my fiance in Manila, there was many nurses that got engaged to many of the soldiers during the Philippines. However, they were split apart, and many of them never saw each other ever again because most of the men died during their time in the Philippines.
There were also a couple of lines that we said throughout the performance that were direct quotes that came from the nurses throughout.
Like Darkest of Egypt quote, the whole entire beginning scene was all direct quotes.
And also their eyes just followed me, because one nurse was literally in surgery when the baton fell, and her supervisor was like, you have to get out now. She's like, no, I have to stay. She goes, no, the nurses are going first, like, you guys are priority to get out of here. We have to keep you all safe from the Japanese.
I didn't read the Norman book, but are there pictures of the nurses?
Mhm.
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
There's pictures of them before the war, there's some pictures of them during the war, right after they were liberated, and there was a couple pictures of them when they were older. There's
Because
this,
the POW MIA recognition day was the largest gathering after the war. There was, I think it was 30 or 40 some of the nurses attended,
Mhm.
and that was the largest group, that was the largest gathering of them since the war ended. That was the largest gathering of them.
and there was
in their lifetimes after
one
the war.
time, the nurses, they all went to like Arlington Cemetery,
Mm.
and I started tearing up when I saw this picture of Cassie Nestor. She was bunkmates with another nurse, and she went to go visit her, but at her grave, and it was just really sad to see these nurses looking at the graves of their former colleagues, their former sisters. So I started crying.
Are a lot of them buried together, or are they just buried with their individual families?
I think some of them are buried with their individual families, but there are some buried in Arlington Cemetery.
Well, thank you, unless someone else.
Oh, well, there was one part about only 20 got to be evacuated.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was.
What happened to them?
It was 97 initially, and those 20 were evacuated, but they were evacuated, but the events in Baton, Corregidor, that took place over the course of like give or take 6 months. So the 20 of them were evacuated, the other 77 went to prison for 3.5, 4 years.
So those 20 nurses were able to go onto a submarine called the Spearfish, and they were able to go flee down to Australia with MacArthur.
Yeah, so at the time period, since the nurses were able to go back to the U.S., 2 movies were actually made during 1943 about the nurses. The only problem about those movies made, because it is the 1940s, so they want to portray females as, you know, romantic and like in love with all the soldiers. So one movie called Proudly We Hail, it was supposed to like showcase, like at the time I watched the trailer, it was showcasing these strong heroine characters, but the nurses, when they came back and learned about this movie, they were very upset, and especially the one nurse that gave all the information, but obviously the movie production company didn't take that information, because there was one scene where the nurse like dropped a grenade in her bra and blew herself up, and they were,
Because she could no longer be with her fiance, who would die in the war,
and that
which
was
was obviously
not
a terrible portrayal of their story.
They changed the whole entire story. They took away the aspect of the medical and the independence, instead they just put in romance and love.
Mm.
You know.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you very
Yeah, thank
much.
you.
We
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yeah.